Chapter 13, Nervous System, Brain and Cranial Nerves, Part 3. So, moving on to the motor areas. The motor area is where we are able to control the skeletal muscles. So this is voluntary, intentional movement of the skeletal muscles. There is the primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex lies adjacent to or anterior to the central sulcus. It's also known as the precentral gyrus. And the primary motor cortex is where all control of the skeletal muscles comes from. Well, almost all. Almost all control of skeletal muscles comes from. And as we know, the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. So the left primary motor cortex controls the right side of the skeletal muscles. The right primary motor cortex controls the skeletal muscles on the left side of the body. Turns out that on the primary motor cortex, we have another homunculus. This time it is the motor homunculus, where again we have a map of the human body laid out on the primary motor cortex with different regions of the body getting different amounts of the brain tissue there. And what determines how much it gets is how many muscles are in that part of the body. So our arms and legs, though they have very large muscles, get a much smaller region of the precentral gyrus because they don't have that many muscles. They're just really big. But things like the hand, the face, the tongue, we have lots and lots of tiny little muscles there. And so they get a lot larger portion of the primary motor cortex. And the weirdest thing is they figured this out because they were doing brain surgery on people, and then they would use electrodes to zap different parts of the primary motor cortex, and then those different muscles would contract. Kind of wild. All right, near the primary motor cortex is the motor speech area. The motor speech area, part of the frontal lobe, controls the muscles for vocalization. So we have lots of little tiny muscles necessary to form the sounds we associate with speech, and they are controlled, at least in part, by the motor speech area. Then we have the associated areas. The associated areas are near motor or sensory regions, and these associated areas help to process and interpret the data that's being arrived by the sensory information and or to help coordinate motor responses. Basically, they are using what's going on nearby to allow for more complicated use of the information. And they are great places for storing memories associated with that sensory input. So we have the premotor cortex next to the primary motor cortex. Premotor cortex is involved in coordinating skilled motor activities. So for instance, something complicated but also repetitive, such as playing the piano, shooting a basketball, driving a car. This is what people often refer to as muscle memory. It's not actually memory in the muscles, it's memory in the premotor cortex that then allows you to more smoothly and easily do those sequential activities. We have the somatosensory associated area near the primary somatosensory cortex. It integrates the sensory information coming from the primary somatosensory cortex, helps us do things like determine textures on things we touch, help understand what the temperature is, relatively speaking, of things we're trying to touch, how hard or softly we're touching something or being touched by something. If you close your eyes, it is what helps you determine the shape of the object and what it is without actually seeing the object. We have visual associated area in the occipital lobe, helps to process visual information and let us actually identify the things we see. So we actually know, oh, that's a chair, that's a person. And even helps us identify individual people by recognizing facial structures. We have the auditory associated area that interprets characteristics of sound, that we actually can distinguish sounds from each other and understand what's loud, what's quiet, what is that sound. And also memories for sound are stored here. Some other associated areas include some functional regions of the brain that are engaged in a little more higher functioning. For instance, the Wernicke area, which is sort of between the parietal and temporal lobes, the Wernicke area is only located in the left hemisphere in most people, and it is involved in recognizing, understanding, and comprehending language. So here is the ability to look at or hear words and actually understand what those words mean. And to be fluent in communication, you need to have a well-functioning motor speech area and Wernicke area, and they interact with each other. If you have damage to one or the other, you might either lose the ability to speak if the motor speech area is damaged, or lose the ability to understand what words mean if the Wernicke area is damaged. There's also an area called the Gnostic area. This integrates various sensory inputs, somatic sensory information, visual and auditory information, pulls that information all together and helps provide a comprehensive understanding of what's going on around us. What does it all mean when everyone else in the room is sitting down, staring at front of the room as some person up there is moving their arms and saying words? You know, basically being aware of your environment and understanding what's going on. All right, there is this famous case of Phineas Gage. He was helping build the railroads. He used a large steel rod to tap down dynamite in little holes. And one time the dynamite went off, the steel rod went through his head, damaged his frontal lobe. We know this because they have his skull, and he survived. However, there was a lot of personality change in him. He went from being capable, well-balanced, and shrewd to becoming irrelevant, fitful, and profane. Basically, he went from being likable to being unlikable. And this is some of the evidence that helped link the frontal lobe to personality and also decision-making functions. All right, tracks. Tracks, again, are bundles of axons in the central nervous system going to similar areas, say carrying similar functions for those areas. And there are different categories or types of tracks. We have, for instance, the association tracks. Association tracks connect different regions in the same hemisphere. So, for instance, short association tracks go from one neighboring gyrus to the next neighboring gyrus. So they don't travel very far, just carrying information from one gyrus to the next that are all near each other. And then there are longer association tracks that connect different gyri that are from one lobe to different gyri in another lobe. So it's a much longer structure connecting different parts of the hemisphere. Then we have commissural tracks. Commissural tracks connect different regions of the two hemispheres. So they're connecting the two hemispheres of the brain, going through some sort of structure to get to the other hemisphere. The largest structure that allows for commissural tracks is the corpus callosum. So this is a cross-section of the corpus callosum connecting the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum. That's where most, say 90% of the connections are. Then there's two smaller commissures out there. There's an anterior commissure and a posterior one. And again, this is connecting the two hemispheres to each other. And finally, there are projection tracks. Projection tracks connect the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex of the cerebrum, to inferior structures of the brain and also to the spinal cord. So going from the cerebrum down to the midbrain, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and also the spinal cord, up and down. And it is the projection tracks that are the ones that flip sides at what's called the decussation of the pyramids, decussation in the pyramids. And that's where the signals for controlling the right side of the body switch to the left side, and the left side of the body switch to the right side. And this occurs in the brain stem. The two hemispheres are not identical. We already mentioned some functions that are localized to one hemisphere or the other. turns out shape-wise they are distinct too. And these slight differences are called battalias. Battalias, basically slight differences in the frontal and occipital lobes. So in a right-handed person, there's the right frontal battalius. This here, the frontal lobe projects a little further forward or anterior than the left frontal lobe. So here we see the right frontal patalia. Then there's the left occipital patalia, which is basically the same idea. The left lobe projects a little further posteriorly than the right one. And this pattern is seen in right-handed individuals. In left-handed individuals, they have the reverse arrangement. Also, as mentioned, there are some functional differences between the right and left hemispheres. These are referred to as cerebral lateralization. So, for instance, the right side or right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. The left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. Other examples is that the left hemisphere is considered the categorical hemisphere, while the right hemisphere is considered the representational hemisphere. So the categorical hemisphere, the left hemisphere, is where we have a lot of the language functions localized. So verbal memory, the Wernicke area, the motor speech area, all in the left hemisphere. Also, the categorical hemisphere is involved in sequential and analytical reasoning tasks, so certain types of thinking, as it were. And again, these categorical hemisphere is primarily the left hemisphere in most people. However, in left-handed people, it could be either hemisphere. Then the representational hemisphere or right hemisphere, things localized to it are visual spatial relationships. So hand-eye coordination tends to be more localized to the right hemisphere, as well as the seat of imagination, artistic skill, pattern perception, being good at recognizing faces. Again, it's the right hemisphere for most people. For left-handed people, it could be either hemisphere. Now, some functions are clearly localized to one hemisphere or another. A lot of the other functions kind of have overlap where there's a bias toward one hemisphere or the other. So it's not all absolute. All right, cerebral vascular accident. This is what we know commonly as a stroke. Cerebral vascular because it is the blood vessels in the brain that is or cerebrum is the issue. And basically blood is not reaching part of the cerebrum. This could be caused by a blocked arterial blood vessel, stopping blood flow to a portion of the brain, or a hemorrhage, a damage to a blood vessel. And so the bleeding out prevents blood from getting to that region of the brain. Strokes can lead to death of brain tissue if there's no way to deal with that lack of blood flow. So after like 10 minutes, that part of the brain is going to probably suffer permanent damage. Some side effects of strokes, symptoms of strokes include blurred vision, weakness, headache, dizziness, difficulty walking, having one side of the body is kind of drooping a bit. And obviously, if you have a stroke in your left hemisphere, then you're going to have trouble controlling and feeling things on the right side of your body. All right, cerebral nuclei. Again, they are found within the white matter of the cerebrum. They're paired, so they are on both the right and left hemispheres, and they help regulate motor output. For instance, we have the caudate nucleus. Caudate nucleus runs parallel to the lateral ventricles, and it's involved in, here it is, it's involved in producing pattern and rhythm of walking movements. So if it's damaged, it makes it more difficult for the person to walk. And we will stop the lecture right here.